When we speak of Plato, we are speaking of the foundational current of Western thought itself. Before him, philosophy was a collection of inquiries. After him, it was a unified system. His ideas are so deeply woven into our civilization's fabric, from our concepts of justice and reality to the very structure of our universities, that understanding him is essential to understanding ourselves. Our journey begins in the tumultuous Athens that shaped his profound, often radical, vision. The name of the broad. The philosopher we universally know as Plato was not given that name by his parents. His birth name, the name given to him by his father, was Aristocles. The name Plato, by which he became known to history and the future, was almost certainly a nickname. This nickname, which translates literally to broad or wide in Greek, likely referenced his notably broad shoulders, a result of his athletic training, or perhaps, symbolically, the expansive, immense scope of his mind and his writings. A noble and aristocratic lineage. Plato was born around 427 BC in the city of Athens, a time when the long and devastating Peloponnesian War was tearing the Greek world apart. Critically, unlike many early philosophers who often came from rural or humble backgrounds, Plato belonged to an incredibly wealthy and politically powerful Athenian family. This elite, privileged background afforded him the very highest level of education and guaranteed his access to the most influential political and social circles of the city. Descent from kings. His family boasted an almost legendary historical pedigree. Through his father, Ariston, Plato claimed direct descent from Codrus, one of the mythical early kings of Athens who supposedly sacrificed himself for the city. This familial connection gave Plato's line a deep, intrinsic, and historical sense of entitlement and civic responsibility concerning the welfare and governance of the city-state. Kinship with Solon, the lawgiver. Through his mother, Berycione, Plato was related to one of the most revered figures in Athenian history, the sage and lawgiver Solon. Solon famously attempted to reform Athenian society and law to prevent tyranny and excessive oligarchy. This direct familial link profoundly influenced Plato's later, lifelong obsession with crafting the perfect, just political constitution and reforming law. A brother's immortalized role, Plato had two full brothers, Glaucon and Adimantus, and a sister, Potone. His brothers, Glaucon and Adimantus, are immortalized in Plato's works, particularly in his most famous and influential dialogue, The Republic. Their role is not minor. Their detailed, challenging philosophical questions and compelling counter-arguments in that text serve as the essential intellectual catalyst for Socrates' lengthy exposition on the nature of justice and the perfect state, an early political destiny. Given his immense aristocratic background and exceptional education, it was fully and conventionally expected that Plato would pursue a serious, dedicated career in politics. This was the inescapable destiny of every well-born, well-educated young man in Athens. Plato himself candidly admitted in his 7th letter that he initially harbored intense ambitions for political engagement and social reform. Training in the arts. Before committing entirely to the pursuit of philosophy, Plato received the customary, rigorous, elite Athenian education. This training included intensive study in gymnastics, music, and poetry. His immense literary skill, evident in the dramatic structure, vivid characterizations, and profound beauty of his dialogues, testifies to this robust early training in rhetoric and aesthetics. The fateful meeting with Socrates. The course of Plato's entire life changed irrevocably around 407 BC, when he was approximately 20 years old. He met Socrates, the controversial barefoot philosopher who prowled the Athenian marketplace, engaging citizens in cross-examination. Plato was utterly captivated and intellectually stunned by Socrates' rigorous intellectual power and unyielding moral integrity. The abandonment of poetry. Legend holds that upon encountering Socrates and becoming his disciple, Plato made a profound symbolic gesture. He burned his own poems and dramatic works, judging his earlier artistic creations as inadequate and inferior compared to the profound existential moral pursuit of philosophy championed by Socrates. This dramatic act represented his total commitment to the Socratic method and the search for objective truth. The Peloponnesian War context. Plato's formative years were spent under the constant, demoralizing shadow of the Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BC, the devastating decades-long conflict between Athens and Sparta. The ultimate and humiliating Athenian defeat and the subsequent total political instability left the young Plato deeply disillusioned with the perceived weakness and chaotic nature of Athenian democracy. The 30 Tyrants connection. Following Athens' final defeat, an ultra-oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants briefly seized political control of the city, initiating a period of terror. Critias, the brutal leader of the 30, was a cousin of Plato's mother, and Charmides, another member, was his uncle. The tyrants initially tried to recruit the well-connected young Plato, but their ruthless, unjust violence and mass executions horrified him, further cementing his profound distrust of unbridled, unjust political power. The trial and execution of Socrates. The single pivotal event that drove Plato fully and permanently away from any practical political career was the trial and execution of Socrates in 399 BC. The very democratic system that Plato already viewed with deep suspicion had condemned the most just and wisest man in Athens to death on fabricated charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. This unjust act became the central, defining trauma in the entire philosophical mission of Plato's life. Plato's absence from the trial. Though present for much of Socrates' life and the preceding philosophical inquiries, Plato records in the Apology that he was absent from the actual trial and subsequent execution. Some scholars suggest this absence was deliberate, perhaps to avoid implicating himself, while Plato himself stated he was ill. Nevertheless, he contributed to the fine proposed by Socrates' friends. The post-Socrates exile, following the state's killing of his mentor, Plato and other immediate Socratic disciples briefly fled Athens for fear of immediate political persecution. He initially stayed with a philosophical community in Megara before embarking on a period of extensive, formative travel that greatly broadened his intellectual and geographical horizons. The influence of the Pythagoreans. During his travels, Plato spent significant time in Magna Graecia, southern Italy, where he encountered the influential Pythagorean philosophical school. The Pythagoreans' intense, almost mystical focus on mathematics, geometry, and the belief that ultimate reality is fundamentally numerical had a lasting and profound impact on Plato, forming the crucial, abstract mathematical backbone of his later theory of forms. Travel to Egypt. Plato is also confidently believed by scholars to have traveled extensively in the ancient world, including a journey to Egypt, then a renowned center of ancient learning and established wisdom. While the exact details of his studies there are difficult to verify, his exposure to sophisticated Egyptian mathematical and astronomical knowledge likely reinforced the value of non-empirical, abstract thought in his mind. The Sicilian Tyrant. Plato undertook his first of 3 ill-fated voyages to Syracuse in Sicily. His explicit purpose was to advise Dionysius I, the powerful tyrant of Syracuse, hoping to implement some of his nascent ideas for the perfect state led by a philosopher king. This initial, idealistic visit ended in spectacular political failure. The sale into slavery. According to a widely repeated, dramatic, though possibly embellished anecdote, the tyrannical Dionysius III grew so utterly tired of Plato's blunt, unyielding philosophical advice that he eventually ordered the philosopher to be sold into slavery while Plato was traveling home. This demonstrates the immense distance between philosophical ideal and political reality. Ransom and rescue. Fortunately, Plato was recognized by a friend or disciple, Anacharis of Cyrene, who promptly and dutifully paid his ransom and secured his immediate freedom, allowing him to return, disillusioned but intact, to Athens around 387 BC, a life event that proved the practical difficulty of applying rational philosophy to real-world, absolute power. The founding of the Academy. Upon his return to Athens in 387 BC, Plato used the ransom money, which he refused to take back, to establish his own school of learning, the Academy. Situated in a grove that's sacred to the local hero Academus, this institution became the first formally organized university in Western history, dedicated to systematic, philosophical, scientific, and mathematical research, the motto of the Academy. Over the entrance to the Academy, Plato is rumored to have inscribed the famous stern motto, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This instruction underscores the immense Pythagorean influence on his mind, viewing geometry and pure mathematics as the essential purifying training ground for abstract philosophical reasoning and the ultimate comprehension of the eternal forms. The enduring influence of the dialogues. Unlike his mentor Socrates, who intentionally wrote nothing down, Plato became an extremely prolific and dedicated writer. His most profound intellectual and literary contribution is the pioneering use of the philosophical dialogue, a literary form that presents philosophical inquiry not as doctrine, but as a dynamic, engaging conversation, usually featuring Socrates as the challenging central figure. The voice of Socrates. In his early and middle works, Plato consciously used the figure of Socrates as his literary mouthpiece to express and develop his own evolving theories. This literary device makes it notoriously challenging for modern scholars to determine precisely where the historical Socrates' ideas end and Plato's own distinctive mature theories begin, leading to a long-standing scholarly debate known as the Socratic problem. A complete philosophical system. Plato's surviving writings cover an astonishing and unprecedented breadth of topics: metaphysics, the ultimate nature of reality; epistemology, the nature of certain knowledge; ethics, moral action; politics, the perfect state; cosmology, the origin of the universe; aesthetics, beauty; and theology. He was the first to offer a truly complete, interconnected, systematic philosophical system addressing virtually every aspect of human life and existence. The 3 periods of the dialogues. Plato's surviving body of dialogues is traditionally, though somewhat fluidly, divided into three distinct chronological periods: early, closely following the historical Socrates and his method, e.g., the Apology; middle, developing his mature, distinct theories, e.g., the Republic; and late, critically re-examining and refining his own mature theories, e.g., the Laws. The evolution of his thought is evident across these periods. The dramatic foundation of Plato's life, his noble birth, his disillusionment with the chaos of politics, and his dedication to the tragic memory of Socrates, set the stage for the creation of his most radical and enduring idea, the theory of forms. That profound theory requires a deep, dedicated exploration. The theory of forms and the nature of reality. The intellectual shift from the practical politics of Athens to the abstract metaphysics of the universe is the great leap Plato engineered. Having been deeply influenced by the mathematical purity of the Pythagoreans and the Socratic quest for universal definitions, Plato devised the single most important and defining concept in his entire system, the theory of forms. For Plato, this was not merely an idea. It was the ultimate objective key to unlocking the true structure of reality and separating genuine knowledge from the confusing chaos of everyday opinion. The necessity of certainty. Plato realized that the physical world we perceive, the world of trees, houses, and people, is constantly changing and perishable. If everything is in perpetual flux, as Heraclitus argued, then certain objective knowledge is impossible, because the object of knowledge would disappear the moment we defined it. Plato argued that true knowledge must be about what is permanent, necessary, and unchanging. The realm of the forms. The forms, often called ideas, are those permanent, unchanging objects of true knowledge. They are eternal, perfect, immutable, and non-spatial blueprints for everything that exists in the changing world we perceive with our senses. Every single physical object, like a particular beautiful statue or a just action, is merely a flawed, imperfect reflection of its single, perfect original form, the form of beauty or the form of justice. The two realms of existence. Plato establishes a clear philosophical dualism between two distinct realms: the visible realm, the material world of change, grasped by the senses and generating only opinion or belief, and the intelligible realm, the world of the forms, grasped purely by the intellect and generating true, certain knowledge. The separation of these two worlds is the cornerstone of his metaphysics. Participation, methexis, the essential philosophical link between a particular physical object, like a specific dog or a geometric shape drawn in the sand, and its eternal form, the form of dogness or the form of circularity, is called participation or methexis. The physical dog is a dog because it imperfectly participates in the perfect, non-physical form of dogness. This is the mechanism by which the forms give reality to the material world. The divided line. To fully explain the hierarchy of reality and its corresponding levels of knowledge, Plato introduced the concept of the divided line in his most famous work, the Republic. This intellectual model precisely separates the cosmos into its four levels, confirming that physical perception is the lowest form of understanding. The hierarchy of knowledge. In the divided line structure, the forms are the highest reality, accessible only by intellection, pure, abstract thought. Below them are mathematical objects, grasped by reason. Below these, in the visible world, are physical objects, grasped by mere belief or common sense. And lowest of all, images, shadows, and reflections grasped by mere imagination. The form of the good. At the absolute apex of this entire hierarchy of the forms, transcending even the forms of justice and beauty, is the form of the good. This is the ultimate source of all existence, intelligibility, truth, and perfection. All other forms derive their being and perfection from the good. The analogy of the sun. In the Republic, Plato explains the illuminating function of the form of the good using the profound analogy of the sun. Just as the physical sun is necessary for sight, it allows us to see physical objects, but is not itself the act of sight or the object being seen. The form of the good is necessary for knowledge. It allows the intellect to understand the other forms, but is not itself knowledge or a form being known. It is the condition for all knowing. The allegory of the cave, Plato's most famous and dramatically powerful literary device for explaining the difficult philosophical journey from ignorance to true knowledge, is the allegory of the cave. It describes prisoners chained since birth, mistaking the flickering shadows projected onto a wall for reality itself. The escape to the light. The philosopher, in this allegory, is the single prisoner who breaks free of the chains, endures the painful journey upward, and finally sees the true world outside, the trees, the sky, and finally the sun, which represents the form of the good. This journey is the painful process of philosophical education and enlightenment. The philosopher's moral duty. The cave allegory illustrates the philosopher's supreme moral and political duty. Once they have reached the light and comprehended the ultimate good, they have a heavy civic obligation to return to the darkness of the cave, the flawed political world, to guide the other prisoners, the citizens, toward a better, more just reality, even at the predictable risk of being violently misunderstood or condemned, just as Socrates was. Knowledge as recollection, anamnesis. In dialogues like the Meno and Phaedo, Plato introduces the famous epistemological theory of recollection, anamnesis. This is the radical idea that the human soul, being eternal, existed in the realm of the forms before its incarnation in the physical body. Therefore, true philosophical learning is not acquiring new information, but actively recalling the perfect, eternal truths the soul already implicitly knows. The Meno's slave boy proof. To provide empirical demonstration of this theory of recollection, Plato presents the famous scene in the Meno where Socrates guides an uneducated slave boy to correctly solve a complex geometric problem purely through methodical questioning and diagrams. Plato argues that the boy's sudden ability to grasp the absolute necessary truth of geometry proves that knowledge of eternal truths is innate to the soul, merely forgotten and requiring a skilled philosopher to prompt its return. Mathematics as the bridge. Because mathematics and geometry deal exclusively with eternal, perfect, non-physical concepts, like the perfect equation, the perfect triangle, or the number 1, they serve as the essential intellectual bridge between the ever-changing, confusing sensible world and the unchanging, objective, intelligible world of the forms. This is why geometry was required at the academy. The Platonic soul and immortality. Plato extensively argued for the immortality of the soul in dialogues such as the Phaedo. His core argument is that the soul must be imperishable because it is simple, rational, and unchanging in its essence, much like the forms it contemplates, and because it is the inherent metaphysical source of life itself, meaning it cannot admit death. The preexistence and transmigration. The theory of recollection, anamnesis, necessarily implies the preexistence of the soul. The soul must have existed before its current body to have encountered the forms. Plato also posits a form of transmigration of souls, reincarnation, where the soul chooses a new life based on its moral conduct in the previous one. The charioteer allegory. In the Phaedrus, Plato beautifully describes the complexity and conflict within the human soul using the allegory of the charioteer. The charioteer represents reason, the rational governing part. The noble white horse represents spirit, thumos, or honorable emotion, and the unruly dark horse represents appetite, base desire. The difficulty of controlling the unruly horse shows the constant inner moral struggle. The three parts of the soul. Plato formally solidified this division of the human soul, psyche, into three distinct hierarchical parts, an idea that directly mirrored the class structure of his perfect state: reason, the rational truth-seeking part; spirit, the emotional, ambitious, honor-seeking part; and appetite, the desiring, sensual, bodily-driven part. Personal justice. For Plato, true personal justice occurs not through external actions, but when these three internal parts of the soul achieve inner harmony under the firm, rational rule of reason. When reason governs the spirit and strictly controls the base appetites, the individual achieves the supreme state of inner order and moral excellence. The nature of beauty. Plato's dialogues, particularly the Symposium, establish that beauty is one of the highest, most potent, and most easily accessible of the forms, acting as a powerful physical reminder of the eternal realm. The famous Ladder of Love describes the soul's ascent toward the form of beauty, beginning with the appreciation of a beautiful person. The ascent to beauty. The philosopher's ascent continues by moving from the beauty of a single body to the beauty of all bodies, then to the appreciation of beautiful ideas, beautiful laws, and beautiful institutions, culminating finally in the intellectual contemplation of beauty itself, which is perfect and unchanging. Platonic love. The popular term Platonic love originates from this philosophical ascent. It is a concept that describes a form of love that transcends mere physical, sensual desire and seeks intellectual and spiritual fulfillment through the shared contemplation of the eternal forms, especially the form of beauty. Plato's cosmological model. In the dialogue Timaeus, Plato presents his complex cosmological model, where a divine craftsman figure, the demiurge, meaning public worker or craftsman, shaped the disordered primordial matter of the universe according to the perfect, eternal model of the forms. This act of shaping brought order and pervasive reason to pre-existing chaos. The world soul. The demiurge also created a perfect, rational, mathematical structure that actively animated the entire cosmos, the world soul. This intricate mathematical structure governs the complex, orderly movements of the stars, planets, and the natural laws of the universe, directly linking the physical world to the supreme rational order of the forms. The geometric elements. In the Timaeus, Plato assigned specific geometric shapes to the four classical elements, showing the ultimate truth is geometric. Earth is the cube, fire is the tetrahedron, air is the octahedron, and water is the icosahedron. This demonstrates his core belief that the ultimate reality of the physical world is rooted in immutable, perfect geometric forms. The Platonic solids. The fifth and final geometric solid, the dodecahedron, was assigned by Plato to the cosmos as a whole, representing the entire ordered universe. These 5 perfect polyhedra, with all sides and angles equal, are still known today in geometry as the Platonic solids and form a key part of his mathematical cosmology. The Platonic dialectic, the central intellectual method for the philosopher to ascend from the fleeting opinions of the visible world to the certain knowledge of the forms, is dialectic. This is the rigorous, systematic, logical process of asking and answering questions, testing definitions, and refining concepts to move beyond contradictory opinions and finally grasp true universal knowledge. The unwritten doctrines. Plato taught his most esoteric and advanced ideas on metaphysics and the ultimate nature of the form of the good only orally within the walls of the academy. These unwritten doctrines were not committed to writing, leading to centuries of intense speculation about his most complex metaphysical concepts concerning the one and the indefinite dyad. The ideal as a standard, the theory of forms serves the standard for all judgment. When we call an action just, we are implicitly comparing it to the perfect, eternal form of justice, even if we cannot perfectly articulate that form. The forms allow for objective moral and aesthetic judgment. The final argument in the Phaedo. In the Phaedo, before Socrates drinks the hemlock, Plato presents the argument from opposites to prove immortality. Life comes from death, and death comes from life, meaning there must be an endless, reciprocal cycle. This requires the soul to survive death and enter a subsequent state of being before being reborn. The ethical imperative, the ultimate ethical consequence of the forms, is the imperative to imitate the forms in one's own life. The good person is one who strives to make their imperfect actions and character resemble the perfect, rational, and harmonious ideal embodied in the form of the good. The search for the forms was not an end in itself, it was a qualification. Only those who had successfully made the arduous intellectual ascent were fit to rule the state. This connection takes us directly to Plato's radical political vision in the Republic. The Republic and the philosopher king. Having ascended the intellectual ladder to glimpse the forms, the true philosopher is not permitted to rest in the light. Plato's entire metaphysical system, the forms, the dual nature of reality, the tripartite soul, was ultimately built as a political qualification. It provided the rigorous standard by which he measured the incompetence of Athenian democracy and justified his most radical political proposal, that the world's chaos could only be cured by the absolute rule of the philosopher king, the primary question of the Republic. Plato's most famous and consequential work, the Republic, Politeia, meaning the Constitution, is contained within 10 books. It begins not with a treatise on government, but with a deceptively simple and existential question posed by Socrates: what is justice? The dialogue is an exhaustive, monumental attempt to define justice, first as an internal state of the soul, and then externally, mirrored in the structure of the ideal state. Justice as harmony. Plato ultimately defines political justice not in the modern sense of equality or fairness, but as harmony and specialization. In the just state, every single class performs its proper, unique function with excellence and absolute dedication, without ever interfering with the responsibilities of the other classes. This perfect division of labor creates an ordered, highly efficient, organic whole. The three classes of the ideal state. The structure of the ideal state is rigidly divided into three distinct classes, which perfectly and deliberately mirror the three parts of the soul: the guardians, rulers, dominated by the rational part of the soul, reason. They are responsible for ruling and making laws. The auxiliaries, warriors, are dominated by the emotional part, spirit. They defend the state and enforce the laws. The producers, workers, dominated by the desiring part, appetite. They provide goods, food, and labor for the entire society. The principle of specialization. The maintenance of the state's justice hinges entirely on the principle of specialization. Plato mandates that each citizen must perform only the single task for which they are best naturally suited by their innate character, their mettle. This ruthless efficiency, based purely on natural ability and aptitude rather than birth or wealth, is the key to the state's functional prosperity and internal stability. The philosopher-king mandate. Plato's most famous and truly radical political claim is that the state should be governed by philosopher-kings. His reasoning is logical. Since only philosophers have completed the ascent to true knowledge by contemplating the forms, especially the form of the good, only they are fit to rule, as their decisions will be based on objective, eternal truth, rather than self-interest, shifting opinion, or common prejudice. The education of the rulers. The guardians, who are the future philosopher-kings, must undergo an intense, state-controlled education beginning in childhood and lasting until the remarkable age of 50. This demanding curriculum includes rigorous physical training, music, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and finally culminates in 5 years of pure, intense training in the dialectic, pure philosophy, to qualify them to grasp the forms. The communal lifestyle of the guardians. To ensure the rulers are absolutely selfless, devoid of personal bias, and entirely loyal to the state, Plato dictates that the guardians must live a communal, intensely ascetic lifestyle. They are strictly forbidden from owning any private property, gold or silver, and they must live together in state-provided communal barracks, receiving only the necessary means for their very simple sustenance from the state. The abolition of the family for rulers. In his most socially controversial policy, Plato suggests that the guardian should not have traditional private families. Children are to be raised communally without knowing their biological parents, thus entirely eliminating the profound risk that personal private family loyalty or affection might compromise the ruler's absolute, undivided loyalty to the state. Equality for women in the ruling class. Plato was astonishingly progressive on the issue of gender for the 4th century BC, arguing for the complete equality of women within the guardian class. He maintained that women who possessed the necessary rational and spirited natures should receive the same intensive education as men and be equally eligible to serve as both auxiliaries and as full-fledged philosopher-kings. The noble lie, to ensure the necessary social stability and secure the willing allegiance of the lower classes to this rigid state structure, Plato posits the necessity of a noble lie, or myth of the metals. This is a foundational myth that tells citizens they were born with specific metals mixed into their souls: gold for the guardians, silver for the auxiliaries, and bronze or iron for the producers. This myth justifies the rigid class hierarchy by claiming it is ordained by nature itself. The three waves of paradox. Socrates introduces his most controversial ideas in the Republic in three stages, which he calls the three waves of paradox that threaten to drown his argument. 1. The equality of women in the guardian class. 2. The communality of wives and children among the guardians. And 3. The absolute rule of the philosopher king. These three concepts form the most difficult social challenges to his utopian vision. The problem with democracy. Plato viewed Athenian-style democracy as fundamentally and fatally flawed because it grants ultimate power to people without the necessary knowledge or virtue to rule, leading to a statewide focus on individual freedom and desire over necessary order and rational law. He saw it as the second worst form of government, just before the absolute decay of tyranny. The allegory of the ship. To vividly illustrate why the general populace is fundamentally unqualified to steer the state, Plato uses the allegory of the ship. The sailors, the chaotic populace, are arguing fiercely over who should steer the ship, the state, ignoring the true pilot, the philosopher, who possesses the expert necessary knowledge of navigation, the forms, required to guide the ship safely. The unhappiness of the rulers. Plato makes a crucial, counterintuitive argument that the philosopher kings, while the most just and wise individuals, are actually not the happiest individuals in the state. True happiness, for Plato, is found in the perfect, undisturbed contemplation of the good which the philosopher king must reluctantly sacrifice to endure the burden of ruling the flawed world for the greater collective good. The blueprint for the perfect state, though radical, was merely one half of Plato's ethical system. His vision of political order was paralleled by a fierce critique of the cultural forces, especially art and poetry, that undermined rational control. The critique of art, the descent into tyranny, and the cosmic order. The philosopher's ascent is a journey of rational purity, leaving behind the shadows of opinion. But if the rulers are to be trained for ultimate justice, every aspect of their education must promote reason and temperance. For Plato, the greatest threat to this internal order came not from external enemies, but from the powerful, seductive, and morally ambiguous influence of art and poetry. Plato's critique of the arts. In the Republic, Plato is famous for his severe and systematic critique of poetry and dramatic arts. He argues fiercely that the arts, especially the sprawling popular narratives of Homer, appeal directly to the lower, irrational parts of the soul, the appetites and disruptive emotions, and are therefore morally corrupting and politically dangerous, as they undermine the necessary fragile rule of reason. Art as imitation, mimesis. Plato argues that art is fundamentally problematic because it is a form of imitation, mimesis. The artist imitates an imperfect physical object, which is itself only an imperfect copy of the true, perfect form. Therefore, the work of art is 3 times removed from the truth and possesses very little genuine reality or knowledge. The painter's lack of knowledge. Plato uses the example of a painter. A painter can accurately depict a bed, but the painter does not have the true knowledge of the form of the bed, which the philosopher contemplates, nor the practical knowledge of how to build a bed, which the craftsman possesses. The painter possesses only a deceptive image, the need for censorship. Consistent with his critique, Plato advocates for a form of state censorship, arguing that young guardians should only be exposed to music and literature that explicitly promotes courage, piety, and rational thought. Anything that depicts the gods or heroes behaving immorally, lamenting excessively, or displaying excessive laughter must be purged from the state's educational curriculum. The banning of the poets. Plato's most radical stance is the potential banishment of the poets from the ideal state. He argues that poets, by stirring up the emotions, undermine the internal harmony of the soul and therefore threaten the external stability of the state, making them dangerous agitators against rational control. The simplicity of guardian music. The music allowed for the guardians must be simple, austere, and martial, reflecting the virtues of courage and temperance. Plato explicitly bans soft or luxurious music that appeals to weak emotions or excessive pleasure, favoring only the Dorian and Phrygian modes because they instill stability and self-control. The descent to tyranny. Following the description of the ideal state, Plato systematically charts the predictable process of political decay. He argues that the ideal constitution will inevitably devolve through 4 stages of unjust government, showing that the ultimate fate of any state is defined by the character of the dominant ruling class. Timocracy. The first stage of decay is timocracy, rule by honor or spirit. In this state, the rulers are driven by the desire for public acclaim, glory, and military success, prioritizing the spirited part of the soul over pure reason. It represents a subtle but inevitable moral compromise from the ideal. Oligarchy. The second stage is oligarchy, rule by wealth. The rulers begin to prize money and property above all else, replacing honor with greed. The state becomes divided between the rich and the poor, losing its unity and creating deep internal resentment and instability. Democracy. The third stage, and the one Plato despised the most, is democracy, ruled by chaotic freedom. Born from the oligarchic excess, democracy is defined by boundless, individual freedom, where all appetites are treated equally, and there is no authority or specialization. This chaos is merely the prelude to tyranny. Tyranny. The final stage of decay is tyranny, absolute rule by base desire. Democracy, driven by its endless hunger for radical freedom, eventually collapses into chaos and fear. The populace grants ultimate power to a single, strong leader, the tyrant, who promises to restore order, but is in reality the slave to his own darkest, most excessive appetites and desires. The tyrannical soul. Plato's most profound psychological insight is that the tyrannical man is the most unhappy of all. Though he has absolute power, his soul is ruled entirely by the irrational, dark, criminal desires, making him permanently anxious, isolated, and utterly incapable of true friendship or inner peace. Plato's cosmological model in Timaeus. Beyond politics, Plato addressed the origins of the physical world in his late dialogue, the Timaeus. This work provides the foundation of Western cosmology, arguing that the universe is not the result of chance, but of rational, benevolent design, according to the eternal forms. The demiurge. The figure responsible for this creation is the demiurge, the divine craftsman. The demiurge is not an all-powerful creator, ex nihilo, out of nothing, but an eternal intelligence who takes pre-existing, disordered matter and shapes it into an orderly cosmos by imposing the perfect geometric and rational structure of the forms onto it. The final purpose of vision. Plato argues that the demiurge gave humans the ability to see the stars and the ordered movements of the heavens for a precise purpose. By observing this perfect, rational order in the cosmos, man is meant to learn to regulate the disorderly revolutions of his own mind and bring his own soul into harmony with the divine cosmic structure. The connection between the perfect order of the heavens and the necessary order of the state is the ultimate argument for the philosopher king. Yet the philosopher was mortal, and the academy had to endure. The unwritten doctrines, the academy, and the great student. The true power of Plato's philosophical life was not just in his books, but in the living, breathing intellectual community he created and sustained. The academy became the primary engine for the transmission of his thought, a place where his most difficult ideas, the ones he dared not commit to the limitations of writing, were debated and refined, influencing a generation of students who would ultimately carry his legacy across the world. The founding of the academy. Plato's decision to found the academy in 387 BC was a revolution in education. It was the first institution in the Western world dedicated to systematic, collaborative, non-stop philosophical inquiry and scientific research, funded by private endowment and focused on a long-term curriculum. It represented the practical application of his belief that knowledge must be pursued outside the fleeting opinions of the market and the assembly. The academy as a cult. The academy was, in some sense, a philosophical and mathematical cult dedicated to the pursuit of the forms. Its members lived and studied together, sharing ideas and challenging each other's assumptions, creating an environment that fostered intense intellectual discipline and a unique communal approach to abstract truth. Plato's unwritten doctrines. Fully aware that writing often fixes and simplifies complex philosophical truths, Plato deliberately reserved his most esoteric and advanced ideas on metaphysics and the ultimate nature of the form of the good for oral teaching within the walls of the academy. These highly complex concepts, often referred to as the unwritten doctrines, were conveyed directly to his advanced students and focused on mathematical principles underlying the forms. The lecture on the good. One of the most famous and frustrating examples of the unwritten doctrines was Plato's public lecture on the form of the good. His student Aristotle records that those attending expected to hear about tangible goods like health, wealth, or happiness, but were instead subjected to a highly abstract and rigorous mathematical discussion concerning the nature of unity and being. Most attendees were utterly bewildered by the focus on abstract numbers and geometric principles. The one and the indefinite dyad, the core of the unwritten doctrines, centered on two supreme metaphysical principles, the one representing unity, order, and goodness, and the indefinite dyad, representing multiplicity, change, and difference. Plato argued that the forms themselves were generated by the interaction of the one acting upon the indefinite dyad. This system was his final attempt to reconcile the seemingly contradictory nature of reality. Plato's greatest student, Plato's most famous and consequential student, was Aristotle. Aristotle arrived at the academy as a brilliant young man of 17 and remained there for a phenomenal 20 years until Plato's death. This relationship between master and student, the idealist and the empiricist, defined the entire subsequent history of Western thought, even though Aristotle eventually broke with his master on the theory of forms. The enduring influence of the academy. The longevity of Plato's institution is astounding. The academy continued to function as a major center of learning in Athens for nearly 900 years, enduring the Hellenistic, Roman, and early Byzantine periods. It was finally closed down only in AD 529 by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, who saw its persistent non-Christian teachings as a threat to the state religion. The late dialogues and self-critique. In his later dialogues, such as the Parmenides and Sophist, Plato demonstrated a remarkable intellectual humility by engaging in profound self-critique. He used the voices of other characters to raise serious, complex logical problems regarding his own seminal theory of forms, ensuring his philosophy remained dynamic and rigorous. The challenge of the third man. The most famous logical difficulty raised against the forms in the Parmenides is the challenge of the third man. The problem asks, if a physical man is large because he participates in the form of largeness, what explains the similarity between the man and the form? A third form would be required, leading to an infinite regress of forms. Plato, through the character of Parmenides, raises this problem without providing an immediate, easy answer. The shift to logic and rigor. The late dialogues are structurally different from the dramatic, narrative-driven middle works. They move toward austere, rigorous, logical analysis, demonstrating Plato's final preoccupation with ensuring his philosophical concepts could withstand the intense scrutiny of pure logic and dialectical method. The doctrine of the statesman. Following the three failures in Syracuse, Plato wrote the dialogue The Statesman, reflecting a significant shift in his political realism. He concluded that while the philosopher king, ruled by a perfectly wise individual, is the absolute ideal, the necessary second-best solution for the real, imperfect world is the absolute rule of law. Strict, unchanging, written laws applied equally to all. The laws, nomoi. As the final vision, Plato's final and longest work, The Laws, nomoi, describes this second-best state. This state is ruled entirely by detailed, immutable laws and incorporates many concessions to practical reality, such as allowing private property, maintaining traditional family structures, and introducing a mixed constitution to prevent the decay into tyranny. It is Plato's ultimate political compromise. The evolution of Plato's thought from the pure, unattainable ideal of the forms to the practical, law-bound state of the laws demonstrates a philosopher constantly grappling with the immense gap between perfection and reality. But even as he died, the questions he posed continued to animate his greatest student. The ethical imperative, the ladder of love, and the master-student divide. The philosophical life for Plato was not simply an intellectual exercise, it was an ethical imperative. The contemplation of the forms was the necessary first step towards achieving the highest moral and spiritual good. For the philosopher, every action, every desire, and every relationship was a challenge to live up to the absolute standard set by the form of the good. This deeply ethical framework is nowhere more beautifully illustrated than in his examination of love and its ultimate purpose. Ethics as the goal of metaphysics. For Plato, the ultimate goal of metaphysics, the study of reality, was always ethics, the study of moral action. Understanding the eternal structure of the universe, particularly the form of the good, was the only reliable foundation for determining how a person ought to live. The person who truly knew the good could not help but act justly. The pursuit of eudaimonia. Plato's entire ethical system is teleological, oriented toward an end goal. This ultimate end is eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing, living well, or human fulfillment, rather than mere pleasure or happiness. Eudaimonia is achieved only through the consistent, rational activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Virtue is knowledge. Plato inherited the famous Socratic dictum that virtue is knowledge. This means that all human evil and vice stem from a lack of true knowledge, ignorance, not from a deliberate choice to be bad. If a person truly understood the form of the good and the nature of justice, they would necessarily act justly, because justice is beneficial to the soul. The role of the rational part. In Plato's Ethics, the rational part of the soul is the supreme moral agent. It is the part capable of contemplating the forms and making decisions based on objective truth. Therefore, the virtuous life is one where reason has achieved complete mastery over the emotional, spirited, and desiring appetitive parts of the soul. The ladder of love, eros. In the dialogue Symposium, the character Diotima, a wise priestess whose words are recounted by Socrates, introduces the concept of the ladder of love. This is a powerful metaphor describing the soul's necessary ascent from base, physical attraction to the ultimate spiritual contemplation of the form of beauty. The first step of the ladder. The ascent begins with the appreciation of a single beautiful body. This is the initial spark of love, eros, a physical attraction that serves as a reminder of the ultimate beauty the soul once knew in the realm of the forms. Ascending to universal beauty, the soul then progresses by recognizing that the beauty in one body is related to the beauty in all bodies. It then moves to the beauty of souls, minds, and laws, realizing that intellectual beauty is superior and more enduring than physical beauty. The final step to the form, the final, highest step of the ladder, is the direct intellectual contemplation of beauty itself, the perfect, eternal, unchangeable form of beauty. This is the moment of true philosophical enlightenment and the highest achievement of love. Plato's definition of beauty. Plato thus defines beauty not as a subjective human feeling or a quality of an object, but as an objective, metaphysical truth that resides in the realm of the forms. Beautiful things are beautiful only insofar as they participate in the single, perfect, eternal standard. The philosopher as lover. The true philosopher is essentially a lover, a philostios, lover of God, wisdom. His love, eros, is not aimed at accumulating material goods or physical partners, but is relentlessly directed toward the eternal truth and goodness found in the forms. The creation of the world soul, Timaeus detail. Returning to his cosmology, in the Timaeus, Plato details the mathematical structure of the world soul created by the demiurge. This structure is a complex mathematical proportional scheme that uses intervals based on the perfect ratios of the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. This reveals Plato's deep-seated conviction that the universe's order is fundamentally musical and numerical. The tripartite cosmos. Plato's cosmology established a tripartite structure for the cosmos that heavily influenced later thought: the model, the perfect forms, the demiurge, or the efficient cause or intelligence, and matter, the primordial chaotic receptacle that is shaped. This framework provided the essential philosophical architecture for Western monotheism. The seeds of the scientific method. Plato, through his emphasis on mathematics and his cosmological models, laid the groundwork for the theoretical approach to science. He taught that one must not only observe the physical world, but must use rational hypothesis and mathematics to deduce the underlying unseen principles that govern nature. This theoretical approach became a cornerstone of modern physics and astronomy. Aristotle's entry into the academy. The profound impact of Plato's genius is best exemplified by the arrival of his most brilliant student, Aristotle. Aristotle arrived at the academy around 367 BC at the age of 17, traveling from Macedon. He was immediately recognized for his exceptional intellect and remained Plato's student and colleague for a colossal period of 20 years, until Plato's death. This long tenure shows the depth of the master-student relationship, a relationship that would eventually fracture the philosophical world. Aristotle's critique of the forms. Despite his long tutelage, Aristotle famously and respectfully rejected the central pillar of Plato's philosophy, the theory of forms. Aristotle argued that placing the perfect essence of an object, its form, in a separate ethereal realm made it impossible to explain how those forms could influence or cause change in the actual physical world. This was the famous problem of the unmoved, mover, and the two worlds. Plato's nickname for Aristotle. According to historical anecdote, Plato recognized the sharp, methodical mind of his greatest student. He reportedly referred to Aristotle as the mind of the school, or the reader, because of his meticulous study habits, acknowledging Aristotle's intellectual precision and immense scholarly capacity, even as their philosophical paths began to diverge. The split over universals. The fundamental disagreement between Plato and Aristotle centered on the nature of universals, e.g., the concept of justice or man. Plato held that the universal exists separate from particulars in the realm of the forms. Aristotle argued that the universal exists in the particulars. The essence of man is found only in actual, individual men. This split created the two defining poles of Western metaphysics, idealism and empiricism. The school's leadership. After Plato. Upon Plato's death in 347 BC, many expected Aristotle to assume leadership of the academy. However, the position was instead offered to Speusippus, Plato's nephew. This decision, possibly reflecting political differences or Aristotle's growing departure from pure Platonism, contributed to Aristotle's decision to leave Athens and eventually found his own rival school, the Lyceum. The legacy of the Laws, Plato's final sprawling work, The Laws, occupied his final decade. It is significantly more expansive and less dramatically focused than the Republic, comprising 12 books in total. The dialogue is noteworthy because it is the only major work of Plato's in which Socrates does not appear as a character, symbolizing Plato's transition away from Socratic ideals and toward institutional realism. The Nocturnal Council's purpose, the ultimate authority in the state outlined in the Laws, is the Nocturnal Council. This small body of elite, elderly, and highly virtuous men was not merely a legislative body, but the philosophical and theological guardian of the state's founding principles. They were tasked with studying the forms and ensuring that all laws and institutions remained rationally aligned with the ultimate good. Plato's views on religion. In the Laws, Plato outlines a stringent, state-controlled theology. He posits three core doctrines that must be accepted by all citizens and enforced by law: belief in the existence of the gods, belief in the gods' providence, that they care for human affairs, and belief in the gods' immutability, that they cannot be influenced by bribes or sacrifices. Denying these principles was treated as a crime. The birth of political science, by moving beyond the description of a purely ideal state, the republic, to the comparative analysis of existing and possible constitutions, the statesman, and finally to the detailed blueprint of a pragmatic, law-governed state, the laws, Plato is credited with the essential founding of political science as a systematic field of inquiry. The unwritten, tradition's persistence. Even after Plato's death, his unwritten doctrines and esoteric mathematical principles continued to be studied and taught by the leaders of the academy for centuries, ensuring that the purely written dialogues never fully captured the entire scope of his genius. The intellectual tension between Plato and Aristotle, the idealist soaring toward the forms, and the empiricist focused on the physical world, is not a contradiction, but a completion. Together, they laid out the opposing poles of rational inquiry that continue to define every academic discipline. The global afterlife, Neoplatonism, language, and the eternal footnote. The philosophical journey that began with one man's grief over his teacher's execution soon expanded to become the intellectual foundation of an entire civilization. Plato's ideas did not die with him. They mutated, evolved, and were adopted across 3 continents, influencing everything from the structure of law to the theological debates of the Middle Ages. His continued relevance is found in the enduring power of his concepts, which became the inescapable starting point for any philosophical debate. The question of language, Cratylus. Plato dedicated an entire dialogue, the Cratylus, to exploring the philosophical relationship between words and the things they signify, language. The central question is, are names and words naturally related to the objects they name, naturalism, or are they merely conventions agreed upon by people, conventionalism? The conventionalist conclusion. While the dialogue explores both sides with intellectual rigor, Plato ultimately leans toward the conventionalist view, arguing that the relation between a word and its object is primarily a result of tradition and agreement. However, he also maintains that words, when properly used by the dialectician, must aim to reflect the true, objective nature of the forms. The philosophy of history. Plato had a distinct, cyclical view of history. He believed that societies and governments follow a predictable, inevitable cycle of decay, starting from the ideal aristocracy and descending into tyranny, only to potentially repeat the cycle again. This cyclical pessimism contrasted sharply with the modern linear view of progress. Plato's influence on early Christianity. Plato's philosophical structure proved immensely useful to early Christian and Gnostic theologians. The distinct separation between the eternal, perfect, spiritual realm, the forms, and the flawed, temporal, material world provided the perfect intellectual architecture for concepts like the eternal soul, the transcendence of God, and the contrast between the city of God and the city of man. The role of Augustine. The most famous synthesis of Platonism and Christianity was achieved by St. Augustine of Hippo, 4th to 5th century AD. Augustine adopted Plato's hierarchy of reality, viewing the Platonic forms as the ideas in the mind of God. This incorporation essentially made Plato the official philosophical patron of the early medieval church. The birth of Neoplatonism in the 3rd century AD, a major philosophical movement known as Neoplatonism, was founded by the philosopher Plotinus in Alexandria. This movement was a profound and complex revival of Plato's metaphysics, incorporating a mystical and religious dimension that had immense influence. The Neoplatonic hierarchy. Neoplatonism simplified and formalized Plato's cosmos into a strict hierarchy of being: the One, the ultimate transcendent source of all; the intellect, corresponding roughly to the forms; and the soul, the mediating agent between the divine and the material world. This provided a spiritual cosmology that lasted for 1,000 years. The influence on Islamic philosophy. During the Islamic Golden Age, Plato's works, along with Aristotle's, were preserved, translated, and deeply studied by major Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna. They attempted to reconcile the political ideals of Plato's Republic with the practical reality of Islamic governance, ensuring Plato's ideas remained alive and debated in the East. The transmissions to the West. During the European High Middle Ages, much of Plato's original work was reintroduced to the West through Arabic translations and commentaries, particularly those found in Spain. This infusion of classical thought fueled the intellectual renaissance of the 12th century. Plato's views on punishment, laws. In his late work of the Laws, Plato established a highly influential theory of punishment. He argued that the purpose of punishment is reformation and deterrence, not mere retribution. Punishment should be corrective, aimed at curing the moral disease, ignorance, that led to the crime, unless the individual is deemed incurable, in which case capital punishment is justified for the sake of the state. That's the doctrine of the mean. While the concept of the golden mean is famously associated with Aristotle, the philosophical groundwork for seeking a balanced, moderate approach between extremes was first explored systematically by Plato in dialogues like The Statesman, where he discusses finding the right measure in political governance. The Philosopher King as a Joke, revisited. Plato was acutely aware of how absurd and impractical the idea of the philosopher king sounded to the common Athenian. At one point in the Republic, Socrates suggests that his companions might be tempted to laugh and think that he is talking nonsense when he first introduces the concept. This self-awareness shows Plato understood the revolutionary nature of his demand. The importance of play. In the Laws, Plato shows a surprisingly modern appreciation for play in early childhood education. He argues that children should be trained for their future roles through play, believing that a person's nature can be observed and guided through their uninhibited games, making play an early form of character assessment. Plato's use of myth. Throughout his work, Plato consistently uses myth, stories that blend theology, cosmology, and morality, like the myth of air or the allegory of the cave, to illustrate truths that he felt were too complex or too emotionally important to be conveyed through dry, pure dialectic alone. These myths function as powerful rhetorical and pedagogical tools. The literary artist, beyond his philosophical content, Plato is universally celebrated as a supreme literary artist. His mastery of Greek prose, his dramatic characterizations, especially Socrates, and his vivid use of metaphor and allegory ensure that his dense philosophical arguments remain deeply engaging and beautifully written, securing his place in literary history as well as philosophy. The vast scope of Plato's thinking, from the perfect order of the cosmos to the ideal structure of the state and the nature of beauty, created the intellectual atmosphere that made all subsequent Western philosophy possible. The sheer scale of this achievement confirms the claim that he is the indispensable foundation. The Great Divide, legal mechanisms, and the enduring problem of universals. The journey into the mind of Plato finds its natural conclusion not just in his death, but in the subsequent intellectual rivalry that defined the next 2 millennia. The philosophical tension between Plato and his greatest student, Aristotle, created the ultimate dividing line in Western thought, the schism between idealism and empiricism, a debate that is still active in every corner of the modern university. The Great Divide over Universals. The fundamental defining disagreement between Plato and Aristotle centered on the problem of universals, the concept of things like redness, justice, or man. Plato held that the universal exists separate from particulars, as an eternal form in another realm. Aristotle vehemently rejected this, arguing that the universal exists in the particulars. The essence of man is found only in actual individual men. The enduring Platonic problem. This philosophical schism is often called the Platonic problem. It is the question of how objects that are constantly changing, particulars, can possess properties that are eternal and unchanging, universals. Plato's solution was the forms. Aristotle's was immanent essence, a debate that remains the heart of metaphysics. The focus of inquiry. The divide is also one of focus. Plato was an idealist, looking upward and outward toward abstract, necessary truth. Aristotle was an empiricist, looking downward and inward toward observation, nature, and the principles discovered through examining the physical world. This difference in method led to the divergence of philosophy and early science. The finality of the laws. Plato's final sprawling work, The Laws, occupied his final decade. It is significantly more expansive and less dramatically focused than the Republic, comprising 12 books in total. The dialogue is noteworthy because it is the only major work of Plato's in which Socrates does not appear as a character, symbolizing Plato's final transition away from Socratic ideals and toward institutional, codified realism. The mixed constitution of the laws. The state described in the laws is designed to avoid the instability of the 4 unjust constitutions detailed in the Republic. It features a mixed constitution, blending elements of monarchy for wisdom and stability, and democracy for freedom and participation, which influenced later political thinkers like Polybius and Cicero. The role of property in the laws. Unlike the communal abolition of property for the guardian class in the Republic, the laws permits private property but imposes strict, detailed limits on wealth accumulation. Plato argued that excessive wealth concentration was a primary cause of social instability and political corruption, and therefore property limits must be legally enforced. The birth of political science. By moving beyond the description of a purely ideal state, the Republic, to the comparative analysis of existing and possible constitutions, the statesman, and finally to the detailed blueprint of a pragmatic, law-governed state, the laws, Plato is credited with the essential founding of political science as a systematic, theoretical field of inquiry. The importance of law in the laws. The most crucial innovation of this late work is Plato's insistence that laws must be preceded by a preamble. This preamble is a persuasive, philosophical argument designed to convince citizens of the law's rationality and inherent goodness before the coercive power of the law is applied. This elevated law from a mere command to an educational tool. The principle of incurable crime. In the laws, Plato outlines a stringent system of criminal justice. He argues that the primary purpose of punishment is correction and deterrence. However, if a criminal act demonstrates a soul so morally diseased as to be incurable, then the state is justified in executing the individual for the sake of the collective good and stability of the city. The Platonic dialogue form. Plato perfected the philosophical dialogue as a literary and pedagogical tool. The form allows for the exploration of multiple viewpoints, the dramatic presentation of philosophical conflict, and the demonstration of the Socratic method of cross-examination, elenchus, making the pursuit of truth a dynamic, shared experience rather than a singular dogma. The arrangement of the dialogues. The dialogues we read today are largely organized into groups of 4, known as tetralogies, based on an arrangement made by the Alexandrian scholar Thrasyllus in the 1st century AD. This arrangement helps organize the vast corpus, but does not necessarily reflect the original publication sequence. The eternal recurrence. Plato's cosmological and historical views often feature the concept of cyclical time. While not identical to later theories, Plato believed that the cosmic order was subject to periodic movements and renewals, hinting at an eternal recurrence of fundamental events and structures driven by the rational necessity of the world soul. The influence on Roman law. Although the Romans primarily adopted Aristotle's practical philosophy for politics and ethics, the abstract theoretical framework of Plato's forms provided the conceptual language for discussing universal legal principles and concepts that transcended local particular laws, thereby contributing to the development of ius gentium, law of nations. The final peaceful death. Plato died in Athens in 347 BC at the age of 80, reportedly while attending a quiet wedding feast. His passing was gentle and peaceful, a final, poignant contrast to the dramatic, unjust, and violent death of his mentor Socrates 30 years earlier. The legacy as a footnote. The enduring, vast, and complex legacy of Plato is best summarized by the famous assertion attributed to philosopher A.N. Whitehead. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This means that every major philosophical problem, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and politics, is either a continuation, a critique, or an answer to a question first posed by Plato. The journey through Plato's life and thought is a journey into the origin of rationality itself. His vision of a perfect, unchanging truth, even if residing in a distant realm of forms, continues to inspire the endless human search for justice, order, and meaning. The Great Divide, legal mechanisms, and the enduring problem of universals. The journey into the mind of Plato finds its natural conclusion, not just in his death, but in the subsequent intellectual rivalry that defined the next 2 millennia. The philosophical tension between Plato and his greatest student, Aristotle, created the ultimate dividing line in Western thought, the schism between idealism and empiricism, a debate that is still active in every corner of the modern university. The Great Divide over universals. The fundamental defining disagreement between Plato and Aristotle centered on the problem of universals, the concept of things like redness, justice, or man. Plato held that the universal exists separate from particulars, as an eternal form in another realm. Aristotle vehemently rejected this, arguing that the universal exists in the particulars, The essence of man is found only in actual individual men. The enduring Platonic problem. This philosophical schism is often called the Platonic problem. It is the question of how objects that are constantly changing, particulars, can possess properties that are eternal and unchanging, universals. Plato's solution was the forms. Aristotle's was immanent essence, of a debate that remains the heart of metaphysics. The focus of inquiry. The divide is also one of focus. Plato was an idealist, looking upward and outward toward abstract, necessary truth. Aristotle was an empiricist, looking downward and inward toward observation, nature, and the principles discovered through examining the physical world. This difference in method led to the divergence of philosophy and early science. The finality of the laws. Plato's final sprawling work, The Laws, occupied his final decade. It is significantly more expansive and less dramatically focused than the Republic, comprising 12 books in total. The dialogue is noteworthy because it is the only major work of Plato's in which Socrates does not appear as a character, symbolizing Plato's final transition away from Socratic ideals and toward institutional, codified realism. The mixed constitution of the laws. The state described in the laws is designed to avoid the instability of the 4 unjust constitutions detailed in the Republic. It features a mixed constitution, blending elements of monarchy for wisdom and stability, and democracy for freedom and participation, which influenced later political thinkers like Polybius and Cicero. The role of property in the laws. Unlike the communal abolition of property for the guardian class in the Republic, the laws permits private property, but imposes strict, detailed limits on wealth accumulation. Plato argued that excessive wealth concentration was a primary cause of social instability and political corruption, and therefore, property limits must be legally enforced. The birth of political science. By moving beyond the description of a purely ideal state, the Republic, to the comparative analysis of existing and possible constitutions, the statesman, and finally to the detailed blueprint of a pragmatic, law-governed state, the laws, Plato is credited with the essential founding of political science as a systematic, theoretical field of inquiry. The importance of law in the laws. The most crucial innovation of this late work is Plato's insistence that laws must be preceded by a preamble. This preamble is a persuasive, philosophical argument designed to convince citizens of the law's rationality and inherent goodness before the coercive power of the law is applied. This elevated law from a mere command to an educational tool. The principle of incurable crime. In the laws, Plato outlines a stringent system of criminal justice. He argues that the primary purpose of punishment is correction and deterrence. However, if a criminal act demonstrates a soul so morally diseased as to be incurable, then the state is justified in executing the individual for the sake of the collective good and stability of the city. The Platonic dialogue form. Plato perfected the philosophical dialogue as a literary and pedagogical tool. The form allows for the exploration of multiple viewpoints, the dramatic presentation of philosophical conflict, and the demonstration of the Socratic method of cross-examination, elenchus, making the pursuit of truth a dynamic, shared experience rather than a singular dogma. The arrangement of the dialogues. The dialogues we read today are largely organized into groups of 4, known as tetralogies, based on an arrangement made by the Alexandrian scholar Thrasyllus in the 1st century AD. This arrangement helps organize the vast corpus, but does not necessarily reflect the original publication sequence. The eternal recurrence, Plato's cosmological and historical views, often feature the concept of cyclical time. While not identical to later theories, Plato believed that the cosmic order was subject to periodic movements and renewals, hinting at an eternal recurrence of fundamental events and structures driven by the rational necessity of the world's soul. The influence on Roman law. Although the Romans primarily adopted Aristotle's practical philosophy for politics and ethics, the abstract, theoretical framework of Plato's forms provided the conceptual language for discussing universal legal principles and concepts that transcended local particular laws, thereby contributing to the development of ius gentium, law of nations. The final peaceful death. Plato died in Athens in 347 BC at the age of 80, reportedly while attending a quiet wedding feast. His passing was gentle and peaceful, a final, poignant contrast to the dramatic, unjust, and violent death of his mentor Socrates 30 years earlier. The legacy as a footnote. The enduring, vast, and complex legacy of Plato is best summarized by the famous assertion attributed to philosopher A.N. Whitehead. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This means that every major philosophical problem, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and politics, is either a continuation, a critique, or an answer to a question first posed by Plato. The journey through Plato's life and thought is a journey into the origin of rationality itself. His vision of a perfect, unchanging truth, even if residing in a distant realm of forms, continues to inspire the endless human search for justice, order, and meaning. The unending pursuit, philosophy as a way of life and the enduring legacy. The ultimate purpose of Plato's vast body of work, from the perfect forms to the detailed laws of the Politeia, was to teach his students how to live a truly examined, rational, and virtuous life. His philosophy was not merely theory, it was a prescription for living well, a manual for achieving the inner harmony he called justice. This final section explores the practical legacy of Plato, the techniques he advocated, and the permanent footprint he left on the world of ideas. Philosophy as preparation for death. Plato famously defined philosophy as the practice of dying and being dead. This phrase, found in the Phaedo, refers not to morbid fascination, but to the constant practice of separating the soul from the body's distracting, corrupting desires and senses. By prioritizing pure reason and the intellect, the philosopher prepares the soul for its final, eternal separation from the material body. The technique of detachment. Plato taught that the philosopher must practice detachment from physical pleasures and needs. Excessive attention to food, drink, physical comfort, or fashion binds the soul to the body. By minimizing these distractions, the philosopher frees the rational mind to focus exclusively on the eternal and unchanging truths of the forms. The role of friendship, philia. While his ladder of love focused on eros, desiring love, Plato valued friendship, philia, as a necessary and high form of relationship. True friendship is not based on utility or pleasure, but on the shared commitment to the pursuit of virtue and truth. Friends serve as intellectual partners, helping each other ascend the ladder of knowledge. The philosophical examination of beliefs. The practical Socratic method, heavily employed by Plato, requires the philosopher to engage in constant self-examination of his own deepest beliefs. This process of rigorous questioning, elenchus, exposes contradictions, unmasks hidden assumptions, and forces the individual to refine their opinions until they align with true, universal definitions. This technique remains central to cognitive therapy today. The universal legacy, Platonic realism. Plato's greatest enduring contribution to logic and metaphysics is Platonic realism. This is the philosophical belief that universals, concepts, properties, numbers, exist objectively and independently of human thought or perception. It is this realism that underpins vast areas of mathematics and theoretical physics, where scientists assume that the mathematical truths they discover are real properties of the universe, not merely human inventions. Influence on political idealism. Every subsequent movement toward political idealism, the belief that the state can and should be organized around rational, ethical, and universal principles, is indebted to Plato's Republic. His works inspired thinkers to demand more from government than mere practicality, compelling them to strive for a state defined by justice and reason. The enduring symbolism of the cave, the allegory of the cave, remains one of the most powerful and flexible metaphors in global culture. It is continually invoked to critique mass media manipulation, dogmatism, and the human tendency to mistake comfortable illusion for difficult truth, serving as a permanent call for intellectual revolution. The philosophical curriculum. Plato's Academy established the core of the Western philosophical curriculum. The required study of logic, dialectic, geometry, and ethics became the foundation of the medieval quadrivium and the liberal arts education that persists in universities worldwide, making him the silent architect of modern higher education. Plato's final wish. According to reports, Plato's dying wish was that his students continue the work of dialectical inquiry, the rigorous, methodical pursuit of truth through logical questioning. His final gentle death while attending a feast symbolized a life lived in harmony, a profound contrast to the violence and chaos he had witnessed, and a final endorsement of the examined life. The unending dialogue. In the end, the sheer vastness of Plato's achievement lies in the fact that he did not provide all the answers, but framed all the questions. Every scholar who grapples with the definition of justice, the nature of knowledge, or the structure of reality is engaging in a dialogue with Plato. His philosophy, recorded in the literary form of conversation, remains an invitation to participate in the endless, necessary, and vital pursuit of truth. His work is not a tombstone, but an eternal open door, inviting the rational soul to ascend toward the light